The first invasion wasn't a war, it was an execution. The sky split open like wounds, and the light that poured through wasn't sunlight but fire. The alien fleet descended in perfect silence, vast metallic leviathans sliding through clouds as if gravity itself bowed before them. Cities screamed before they burned. New York fell in 6 hours. London in 4. Tokyo never even had the chance to send a distress signal. The invaders, later named the Scythe Dominion, moved with machine precision and divine cruelty, turning entire metropolises into molten craters. Their weapons were not bullets or bombs, but waves of energy that erased matter itself, folding steel and bone into dust. Humanity's great cities, symbols of centuries of progress, became graveyards suspended in a haze of electric storms. And yet, even as the skies boiled, humanity refused to disappear. Commander Elias Rourke was among the few who had seen it coming. As the former head of Earth's Orbital Defense Initiative, he had predicted that the first strike wouldn't target governments, it would target faith. The Dominion didn't destroy militaries first. They destroyed monuments, libraries, schools, and homes. They understood that to break humanity, you had to break its memory. When the orbital network fell, Elias led what remained of his task force underground, into the skeletal remains of the New York City subway system. There, among the dripping pipes and shattered rails, a new world began to breathe. A world of the lost and the furious. The resistance was born not from generals or politicians, but from survivors who refused to die quietly. The tunnels beneath the city became their veins, pulsing with life again. Flickering lights cast long shadows on walls covered with maps drawn in charcoal and blood. Makeshift hospitals treated burns from plasma fire. Engineers salvaged alien debris to craft weapons that shouldn't exist. Children learned to reload rifles before they learned to read. The last of humanity was no longer living, they were preparing. Elias stood before a cracked mirror in a small chamber once used as a maintenance hub. The reflection that stared back at him was a ghost. Gray eyes, stubble, and a scar that ran down his temple like lightning. He pressed his hand against the cold steel of the wall and whispered, "You wanted soldiers, Elias, now you've got ghosts." Behind him, footsteps echoed. Dr. Lyra Vance entered the room, her hair tied in a hasty knot, streaked with soot and oil. She had been one of the lead scientists for the Global Energy Commission, once working to end wars by providing infinite clean power. Now her invention, the resonant core, was humanity's last hope for vengeance. She dropped a metal casing onto the table, the faint hum of alien energy emanating from it. "It's ready," she said. "But it won't last long. The power draw is unstable." Elias turned toward her. "How unstable?" "Enough to level 3 city blocks if we're wrong," she said flatly. "But if we're right, we can shut down one of their orbital spires. Maybe more." Elias stared at the humming device. "Then we'll be right." Above ground, the Dominion's drones prowled endlessly. They hovered between crumbling skyscrapers, their sensor arrays glowing red through the dust storms. Human corpses had become data points, their bioelectric energy harvested for alien use. The Earth was no longer a planet. It was a resource field carved open and drained. Yet beneath it all, in the unseen labyrinth of the dead, something began to stir. The resistance wasn't just hiding, they were evolving. In the central chamber of their underground base, a massive holographic map projected the remains of the world. Glowing dots marked every known resistance cell, from the underground cities of Berlin to the ice caverns beneath Siberia. They were scattered, fragmented, and bleeding, but connected. Elias slammed his fist on the table. "We need unity, not pockets of chaos. If we can't fight as one, we'll die as many." Lyra looked at him, her voice low. "You're asking for miracles." "No," Elias said. "I'm asking for communication." He gestured toward the damaged comm array, a patchwork of alien transmitters fused with human circuitry. "Get this working. If we can talk to the others, we can rise together." For days, the tunnels roared with work. Sparks flew as engineers welded plates together. Cables hissed and generators groaned. Above, the surface trembled with the weight of alien footsteps. The Scythe Dominion had begun constructing assimilation towers, enormous monoliths that burrowed into the planet's crust, rewriting the Earth's molecular structure. The air itself shimmered with nanite fog. Humanity was running out of time. Late one night, Elias climbed through a maintenance hatch leading to the surface. The world above was unrecognizable. The skyline of New York was a forest of glass bones. Skyscrapers melted into strange organic curves. Rivers of blue energy flowed through the streets like veins of a dying creature. The moon glowed red through the haze of the alien occupation. In the distance, he saw one of the Dominion's spires pierce the clouds, its pulsing light synchronizing with his heartbeat. The sight filled him with equal parts rage and awe. "You took our cities," he muttered, "but not our spirit." A faint rustle behind him drew his attention. A small girl no older than 9 emerged from the rubble clutching a metal teddy bear. Her eyes glowed faintly, a sign of exposure to alien nanites. "Are you one of them?" she whispered. Elias knelt, his voice soft. "No, I'm one of us." She nodded, stepping closer. "They said everyone up here was gone." He looked out over the horizon where alien towers blinked like cold stars. "Not everyone," he said. "Some of us are still fighting." He led her back down into the tunnels where Lyra and the others waited. When they saw the child, something shifted. For the first time in weeks, people smiled. Hope wasn't loud. It was a whisper, a heartbeat, a reminder that they were still human. That night, Elias stood before the resistance once more. "They took the surface," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "They took the cities, the towers, the sky. But beneath their feet, beneath their machines, beneath their arrogance, we still breathe. We still fight. And from these ruins we will rise." The crowd erupted in cheers that shook the steel walls. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was life. And life was enough to begin again. Deep within the tunnels, the resonant core pulsed brighter, like a heartbeat syncing with the earth itself. The war for the surface was over, but the war for humanity's soul was only beginning. The tunnels beneath New York trembled as if the city above was taking its last breath. The alien spires pulsed with eerie light, sending waves of magnetic static through the air that made the walls hum like tuning forks. It had been 6 months since the fall of the last free city. The surface world now belonged entirely to the Scythe Dominion. But underground, humanity's defiance had become something more dangerous, a growing consciousness, a network of rebellion stretching from continent to continent. Commander Elias Rourke sat hunched over a map projected on the metal table before him, lines of red light crisscrossing through the holographic grid. Every line was a tunnel, every point a resistance cell. Most of them had gone dark. Only 27 remained. His reflection flickered across the hologram. Tired eyes, hollow cheeks, the kind of expression worn by men who had lost everything but purpose. Beside him, Dr. Lyra Vance adjusted her wrist display, scanning data feeds from scavenged alien tech. "Their energy readings have changed again," she muttered. "The Dominion spires are synchronizing across the planet. It's like they're rewiring the Earth itself." Elias leaned forward. "For what?" "Terraforming," she replied grimly. "They're turning the atmosphere into something they can breathe indefinitely. Within a year, this planet won't even belong to us biologically." He stared at the map in silence before whispering, "Then we take one of their hearts before the year ends." That heart was located in the ruins of Chicago, a city now serving as the Dominion's primary energy node. From there, alien power conduits stretched like arteries through the planet's crust, feeding the entire invasion fleet. If humanity could destroy it, they could cripple the Dominion's global network long enough to strike back. But to do that, they needed to activate Pulsefire, the weapon Lyra had built from alien core fragments. It was capable of releasing a magnetic wave strong enough to fry alien circuits across hundreds of miles. The problem was power. "We'll need an energy source equivalent to one of their spires," Lyra said, folding her arms. "And the only one close enough is in Chicago itself." Elias cracked a thin smile. "Then that's where we go." The room fell silent. Every soldier in earshot understood what that meant, suicide. But no one objected. They all knew that death was no longer the worst outcome. Extinction was. Within a week, a convoy of makeshift armored transports rolled through the underground highways beneath the wastelands. The vehicles were built from subway cars and scavenged tank parts, their engines roaring like old beasts reborn. Along the way, they passed through forgotten towns, ghost settlements where dust-covered skeletons and alien roots crawled over old signs like veins of silver. In one abandoned church, Elias stopped briefly, standing beneath a half-burned crucifix. The irony was cruel. The aliens had destroyed gods along with nations. "We made our own heaven," he murmured, "and they took it apart." Lyra stood beside him, adjusting her rifle. "Then we build hell for them instead." The journey to Chicago took 12 days. They moved only at night, hiding from Dominion scouts that glided silently across the wastelands.
By early 1942, The Empire of Japan stood at the height of its power. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Southeast Asia, the rising sun dominated half the Pacific. Its fleets moved like a storm, unstoppable, precise, and lethal. Hong Kong had fallen. Singapore, once called the Gibraltar of the East, lay in ruins. The Philippines were collapsing, their defenders on Bataan and Corregidor clinging to hopeless resistance. Japan's expansion stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Solomon Islands. Every victory reinforced the belief that their empire was destined to rule the Pacific for 1,000 years. But in Tokyo's war rooms beneath the triumph, there was unease. The United States, though battered, was not broken. American industry, awakened by the shock of Pearl Harbor, was beginning to roar. New carriers were rolling off the docks. Pilots were training day and night. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, knew the Americans would strike back, and he intended to destroy them before they could. His plan was bold, even audacious. He would lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a trap near a small isolated atoll called Midway, barely 2 miles wide and surrounded by endless ocean. The Japanese believed that with Midway captured, Hawaii would be within reach, and America's presence in the Pacific would collapse. Yamamoto's fleet was a masterpiece of naval might. 4 massive aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. They carried 248 aircraft and thousands of men who had once reduced Pearl Harbor to flames. To them, Midway would be a finishing blow, a decisive strike to end the war before American industry could turn the tide. Yet across the ocean, in dimly lit rooms at Pearl Harbor, a handful of American code breakers had achieved what no weapon could. Under Commander Joseph Rochefort, a secret team in Station Hypo had cracked parts of Japan's JN-25 naval code. Through fragments, dates, and cryptic weather reports, they pieced together a revelation. The Japanese target identified as AF was Midway. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, took a gamble that would shape history. With barely enough carriers to face Yamamoto's armada, he decided to confront Japan head-on. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown were sent to lie in wait northeast of Midway, hidden among the waves, ready to ambush an enemy that believed it was invisible. In those tense final days before battle, sailors worked silently under the tropical sun, painting decks, loading bombs, checking engines, and writing letters home. None knew that in just a few days, they would fight in one of the most decisive and unexpected battles in history. And none could imagine that in a span of barely 5 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific would shift forever. Midway was not just another battle. It was the moment when courage, intelligence, and fate converged to halt an empire's advance. The calm before the storm had ended. The Pacific was about to ignite. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the horizon around Midway Atoll burned with the first light of dawn. The tropical air was heavy, the ocean deceptively calm. Beneath that surface, 2 mighty fleets, one American, one Japanese, moved unseen, converging on a point that would decide the fate of the Pacific. At 4:30 a.m., the silence was shattered as Japanese carrier decks roared to life. Crews rushed across the hangars of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, preparing over 100 aircraft for takeoff. Engines screamed, propellers blurred, and flight leaders climbed into cockpits marked with the red sun of the rising empire. Within minutes, waves of bombers and fighters thundered into the sky, bound for Midway Island. Their mission was simple: annihilate the American airfield and destroy any resistance before a second wave delivered the finishing blow. On Midway itself, Marines and Navy personnel were already on alert. American radar, crude but functional, had detected the incoming strike. Sirens wailed. Pilots sprinted toward their planes. Buffaloes, Wildcats, and dauntless dive bombers, outdated machines compared to Japan's sleek Zeros. But they took off anyway, fully aware they were flying into overwhelming odds. At 6:20 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fell. Explosions ripped across the island as hangars, runways, and fuel tanks erupted in flames. Anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. Japanese fighters swooped low, strafing gun emplacements with deadly precision. In 20 minutes, Midway was a smoking inferno, but it was not silent. American gunners, battered yet unbroken, continued to fire back. The defenders had survived the first wave. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carriers, received the news that Midway's air defenses were not destroyed. He hesitated, a moment that would prove fatal. Nagumo's original plan called for a second strike, but his scout planes were still out searching for the American fleet. Then came the report that would change everything. An enemy force, possibly carriers, had been sighted to the northeast. In that instant, Nagumo faced an impossible choice. Should he rearm his planes for another strike on Midway, or switch their loads to torpedoes to face the newly discovered enemy ships? He chose the latter. The order rippled through his fleet and chaos followed. Below deck, armorers scrambled to change bomb loads. Refueling hoses snaked across hangars, and fueled aircraft sat wing to wing, an accident waiting to happen. It was a deadly mixture of high-octane fuel and live ordnance, an explosive trap none of them could see forming. At that same moment, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had already launched their own aircraft. Admiral Raymond Spruance, acting under Nimitz's orders, had struck first. American torpedo bombers and dive bombers roared toward the enemy, searching the endless ocean for the Japanese fleet. Many would never return. As Midway burned and Nagumo's decks turned into a bomb-laden powder keg, fate began aligning itself for the turning point of the war. The trap Japan thought it had set was closing, on itself. The battle that was supposed to annihilate the last of America's carrier strength was about to become a disaster, unlike any Japan had ever known. The clash at Midway had begun, and the clock was ticking toward those 5 fateful minutes that would change everything. By 7 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the Pacific sky was alive with thunder. American carrier groups had committed everything they had to find and strike the Japanese fleet before it could launch its second blow. But the vast ocean was a cruel ally. Many squadrons flew in the wrong direction, guided only by uncertain coordinates and fading radio signals. Yet among those who did find the enemy, none would pay a higher price than the torpedo squadrons. The first to arrive were the men of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet. 15 lumbering TBD devastators droned low over the sea, flying without fighter escort. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had argued fiercely with his superiors the night before, insisting he knew where the Japanese would be. His instincts were right. As they approached the glinting shapes of the Japanese carriers, Waldron's men tightened formation, throttles open to maximum speed. The enemy spotted them instantly. Dozens of Zeros peeled off from combat air patrol, screaming downward like hawks on prey. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The devastators, slow and obsolete, became easy targets. Japanese fighters tore through their formations, guns blazing. One by one, the torpedo planes burst into flames or slammed into the sea. Waldron was shot down early, his plane disappearing beneath the waves. His gunner, Ensign George Gay, wounded but alive, watched helplessly from the water as his entire squadron was annihilated. Not a single torpedo hit its target. 15 planes went in. 14 pilots never returned. Moments later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise appeared on the horizon. They too pressed their attack at sea level, flying straight into the storm. They had no cover, no dive bombers above, no fighters to protect them. Again, the Zeros swooped in with merciless precision. Within minutes, the sky was filled with smoke and fire. Only a handful of Americans made it close enough to drop their torpedoes, which missed or malfunctioned. Seconds later, they too were gone. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown. They met the same fate. Their devastators, struggling against fierce anti-aircraft fire, were ripped apart before they could close within striking distance. Across 3 squadrons, 35 torpedo bombers had launched. Only one man survived. From the surface of the Pacific, Ensign George Gay floated alone amid wreckage and oil, watching the battle unfold above him. He would become the lone witness to what happened next, the most critical turn in the entire war. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was not in vain. Their suicidal attacks had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, far from the clouds. Their carriers, now swarming with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for a counterstrike, were utterly exposed. At that exact moment, high above the ocean, unseen and unheard, American dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown were descending through the clouds. They had arrived by chance, guided not by radar but by a pilot's instinct and a navigator's desperate guess. Below them lay the 4 Japanese carriers, their decks cluttered with fully fueled planes and bombs waiting to be loaded. The torpedo squadrons had bought the Americans the one thing no machine could create: time. 5 minutes later, the sky would open up and the fate of the Pacific would be decided in fire. At precisely 10:20 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the heavens split open over the Pacific. From 20,000 feet above the sea, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers of USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown broke through the clouds and found themselves staring directly at the heart of the Japanese carrier force. Below them lay the pride of the Imperial Navy, Akagi. Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu spread across the sapphire waters, their decks glinting in the sunlight, swarming with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for a final strike on the American fleet. What the Japanese could not know was that their moment of triumph had turned into a fatal trap. The timing was a miracle of fate and bravery. American torpedo squadrons had been annihilated hours earlier, yet their doomed attacks had forced the Japanese carriers into a state of chaos. Planes were landing, refueling lines snaked across the decks, and bombs lay exposed on the flight lines. Fuel fumes hung in the air like invisible gunpowder, and at that very instant, from the thin white clouds above, Commander Clarence McCluskey led his Dauntlesses into a near-vertical dive. The air screamed around them. The altimeters spun like mad. Pilots gritted their teeth as G-forces crushed their bodies. Below, the Japanese sailors looked up in confusion, then terror, as hundreds of tiny dots grew larger, plunging straight toward them. The Dauntless was not a fast or glamorous plane, but it was built for one thing: precision death from the sky. Bomb bay doors opened. The first American bomb found its mark on Kaga, striking the flight deck squarely amid ships crowded with fueled planes. The explosion ripped through the carrier's heart, igniting fuel tanks and ammunition. Within seconds, the entire deck became an inferno. Flames shot hundreds of feet high, melting steel and turning men to shadows in the firelight. Another Dauntless, flown by Lieutenant Richard Best, peeled off and aimed for Akagi, the flagship of Admiral Nagumo himself. His bomb struck near the elevator shaft, penetrating deep into the hangar. The detonation blew open the ship's core, turning the once mighty carrier into a burning pyre. In minutes, Akagi was dead in the water, smoke billowing skyward like a black banner of defeat. Simultaneously, Soryu was hit by 3 direct strikes from Yorktown's bombers. Her flight deck erupted in a chain of explosions, ammunition cooking off in thunderous bursts that tore through bulkheads and decks. Sailors leapt overboard as the flames devoured the ship. By 10:25 a.m., barely 5 minutes after the first bomb fell, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were fatally hit. During those 5 minutes, the Imperial Navy lost the beating heart of its air power, the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor only 6 months earlier. McCluskey's men pulled out of their dives and climbed away through the smoke, stunned at the sight of what they had done. Below, the Pacific was a nightmare of fire and ruin. The sky, once filled with the proud formation of Japan's naval air arm, was now empty, but for smoke and drifting debris. Yet the battle was not over. Far to the north, Hiryu, the lone surviving carrier, prepared to strike back in vengeance. Her pilots, furious and desperate, readied their own counterattack. The Battle of Midway was about to enter its bloodiest phase. But for that brief moment, the U.S. Navy had achieved what no one thought possible: the destruction of Japan's carrier force in a single, lightning-fast blow. The tide of the Pacific had turned in 5 burning minutes. The sea boiled with the wreckage of burning carriers as black smoke clawed into the sky. Yet far to the north, one ship still fought on, the Japanese carrier Hiryu. Under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, she was now the sole survivor of the once invincible Kido Butai. Her decks trembled as fuel lines hissed, mechanics screamed orders, and armorers hurried to load bombs under the wings of dive bombers. The Japanese fleet had taken a mortal blow, but Yamaguchi refused to yield. He was a man of samurai spirit, trained to fight to the end. "We will strike back," he ordered, his face calm despite the inferno miles away. The pilots of Hiryu, many veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, listened in grim silence. They knew this could be their final mission. Fuel was scarce. The horizon was filled with enemy patrols and the air smelled of death. But they were Imperial Navy aviators, raised to die for the Emperor. With a sharp blast of the klaxon, Engines roared to life. The first counterstrike lifted off the deck, 18 bombers escorted by 0 fighters. They climbed through the smoke of burning oil, the sun flashing off their canopies as they raced toward the faint signal of an American carrier, USS Yorktown. Below, the American sailors had no idea that a fresh wave of death was streaking toward them. On Yorktown's deck, crews worked feverishly to recover bombers from the morning attack. Pilots, drenched in sweat, refueled and rearmed for what they thought was a finishing blow. Then the radar operator's voice cracked through the intercom. "Enemy planes inbound, 40 miles. Klaxons blared. Deck crews scrambled. Gunners swung their weapons toward the sky as Yorktown turned into the wind. The Japanese dive bombers appeared moments later, slicing through the clouds with precision that came only from years of brutal training. Anti-aircraft guns thundered. Black puffs of flak filled the sky. Yet the Japanese pilots, undeterred, plunged through the bursts, diving at near-suicidal angles. Bombs began to fall. The first missed wide, but the second struck Yorktown amidships with a violent roar. Fire erupted instantly. A second bomb tore through the flight deck, hurling sailors into the air. The ship shuddered, listing to port as fuel lines caught fire. Smoke filled the air as men fought to contain the blaze, dragging hoses across the molten deck, while medics pulled the wounded into the shade of burning planes. Within minutes, Yorktown was crippled, but not destroyed. The crew, refusing to abandon ship, rallied under Captain Elliot Buckmaster's command. Miraculously, damage control teams stabilized the fires, patched the holes, and brought the carrier back to operational status within hours. When the smoke cleared, Yorktown still floated, a testament to American resilience. Meanwhile, Hiryu's pilots, thinking they had sunk the carrier, radioed victory and turned home. Their triumph was short-lived. American scouts had found Hiryu. Above the Pacific, McCluskey's dauntless bombers regrouped once again. With fuel running low and daylight fading, they began their final dive, this time aimed squarely at the last Japanese carrier still in the fight. The vengeance of Midway was about to be complete. By late afternoon on June 4, 1942, the Pacific was a graveyard of steel. Smoke curled from the shattered hulks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, now sinking beneath the waves, their once proud flight decks twisted and burning. But far to the northwest, Hiryu, the lone surviving carrier, still sailed defiantly through the chaos, her decks a frenzy of activity. Mechanics worked without pause, sweat and soot caking their faces as they prepared the final counterstrike. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, calm and resolute, stood on the bridge. His face was a mask of resolve, his eyes reflecting both duty and fatalism. The Japanese Empire had staked everything on Midway. If they failed here, the dream of total dominance in the Pacific would die. "Launch the next wave," he ordered. This time it would be torpedo bombers, Nakajima B-5Ns armed with Type 91 torpedoes. Their target once again the American carrier Yorktown, which reconnaissance mistakenly reported as newly sighted and undamaged. The irony was cruel. Yorktown, already battered and barely afloat, was about to face its second death. As the Hiryu's second strike force roared off the deck, the sea below shimmered with the reflection of their passing shadows. The American fleet, having regained momentary control, spotted them on radar at 2:40 p.m. The alarms howled. Gunners, already exhausted from earlier attacks, manned their stations once again. Fighters from Yorktown's escort ships scrambled into the sky to intercept. The Japanese torpedo planes approached low and fast, hugging the ocean's surface to evade detection. But this time the Americans were ready. Wildcat fighters tore into their formation, and anti-aircraft batteries filled the air with flak. The sky became a storm of fire and metal. Yet the Japanese pressed on. 2 torpedoes found their mark, slamming into Yorktown's starboard side with a deafening explosion. The ship shuddered violently. Power failed. The deck tilted. Within minutes, Yorktown began to list heavily, fires erupting across her hangar bay. Captain Buckmaster, realizing the carrier could not be saved, gave the order to abandon ship. Lifeboats splashed into the sea as men leaped from the flaming deck. The once proud carrier that had fought at Coral Sea and now Midway lay crippled, her battle done. But even as she burned, she had done her duty. The Yorktown had absorbed the fury meant for the rest of the American fleet, and in doing so, gave her comrades the chance to deliver the killing blow. At that same moment, McCluskey's dauntless bombers, now guided by the light of the setting sun, found Hiryu. The last Japanese carrier was steaming north, her flight deck filled with planes rearming for a third strike. The Dauntlesses dived almost silently out of the heavens. There was no warning, no time to react. The first bomb struck amidships, detonating the fuel lines beneath the deck. The second exploded near the island structure, engulfing the bridge in fire. The third ripped through the hangar, igniting dozens of armed planes. In less than a minute, Hiryu was a blazing inferno, her once white hull now blackened by smoke and flame. Yamaguchi refused to abandon his ship. "We will go down with her," he declared to his crew. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hiryu, the last flame of Japan's carrier power, slipped beneath the waves. With her death, the heart of the Imperial Navy's striking force was extinguished. The Battle of Midway was not just turning, it was ending. As darkness descended on June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was a canvas of destruction. Fires still burned where proud carriers had once sailed, their twisted skeletons glowing dimly against the fading light. The air smelled of salt, oil, and death. The great carrier duel that had begun at dawn was over, but the night would bring its own peril. Across the horizon, scattered ships searched for survivors, men from both sides clinging to life amid the wreckage of war. On the American side, Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters in Pearl Harbor had received the first fragmentary reports. At first it was confusion, 4 enemy carriers possibly damaged, 2 confirmed sinking, yet U.S. losses unclear. Then came the crucial transmission from Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Yorktown abandoned but afloat. Enemy carrier Hiryu burning. Those words marked a moment in history. The tide of the Pacific War had shifted, though few yet grasped its magnitude. On board the surviving U.S. carriers Enterprise and Hornet, crews labored through the night. The decks were strewn with twisted metal, burned planes, and the bodies of men who had given everything. Medics worked by flashlight, tending to pilots with shattered limbs and burned skin. Chaplains murmured prayers over the dead. Below decks, exhausted mechanics cleaned the soot from engines, preparing for the possibility of a renewed fight at dawn. Meanwhile, out at sea, destroyers and cruisers searched the waters for downed pilots. Many had been floating for hours, clinging to rafts or debris as sharks circled beneath them. When rescue lights finally swept over the waves, men wept openly. "I thought I'd never see the sunrise," one pilot whispered as sailors pulled him aboard. But amid the relief there was grief. The men of Yorktown watched from lifeboats as their beloved ship slowly settled in the water. Fires still burned faintly along her decks, and every groan of metal echoed like a farewell. Captain Buckmaster refused to leave her until the last possible moment. When the sun rose the next morning, Yorktown was still afloat, defiant even in death. Japanese submarines prowling nearby saw the burning hulk and launched a final act of vengeance. 2 torpedoes struck, sealing her fate. Slowly she rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. The ship that had survived Pearl Harbor's aftermath, Coral Sea and Midway, was gone. But her sacrifice had changed the course of the war. On the Japanese side, the night was one of disbelief. Messages from surviving destroyers painted a picture of total ruin. 4 carriers lost, their air crews decimated, the core of Japan's naval aviation erased in a single day. Admiral Nagumo's once proud Kido Butai had been annihilated. In the cabin of the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto read the reports in silence. His face betrayed nothing, but deep inside he knew the truth. Japan's offensive power was broken. "The war," he murmured to an aide, "has turned against us." By the time dawn broke over the smoking sea, the balance of the Pacific had shifted forever. The once invincible Imperial Navy had met its reckoning. Midway had been more than a battle. It was the beginning of the end for Japan's ambitions of empire. The dawn of June 5, 1942, broke quietly over the Pacific. The smoke of battle still drifted across the waves, but the guns had fallen silent. The Battle of Midway was over, though its magnitude was only beginning to be understood. For the men aboard the American carriers, exhaustion replaced adrenaline. They had fought and won a battle that defied all odds. In the ready rooms, pilots sat in stunned silence, replaying every dive, every explosion, every desperate moment when the ocean below had seemed ready to swallow them whole. Some men stared blankly at the sea. Others quietly wept. It had been victory, but at a terrible price. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had taken command after Fletcher's withdrawal, paced the deck of the Enterprise in deep contemplation. Reports were pouring in. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, destroyed. The might of the Imperial Navy's first-line carrier force had been erased in a single day. It was a triumph so vast that even Nimitz back at Pearl Harbor could scarcely believe the scale. "God bless those boys," he said simply, as he read the decoded message confirming the victory. But Spruance knew that the battle was not just won by courage, it was won by intelligence, luck, and timing. The victory had begun weeks earlier, in rooms filled not with smoke and steel, but with paper and radio static. The cryptanalysts of Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken the Japanese code, revealing that AF was Midway. Their warning allowed the US to prepare an ambush. The men who had pored over endless strings of letters and numbers had given Nimitz the power to fight on his own terms. Without them, the US carriers might have been caught off guard, and the Pacific might have fallen into Japanese hands. Now, as word spread through the fleet, the emotional weight of what had happened began to sink in. Messages crackled over the radios, filled with cautious celebration. On Enterprise, a simple message was broadcast to all hands. "This is the greatest victory in naval history." Sailors cheered, hugged, and wept. For many, it was the first glimmer of hope since the dark days of Pearl Harbor. America had struck back, and this time it was Japan that had paid the price. But amid the triumph there was mourning. Hundreds of American sailors and airmen had not returned. The flight decks bore the scars of battle, burned-out planes, bullet holes, and the silent helmets of fallen pilots laid neatly along the edge of the deck. In the wardrooms, chaplains read from the Bible over makeshift altars. "Greater love hath no man than this," one chaplain said, "that a man lay down his life for his friends." Those words hung in the air as the sea breeze carried the faint scent of oil and smoke. Back in Tokyo, the reaction was very different. The Japanese High Command tried to suppress the full truth of the disaster. Newspapers reported a strategic withdrawal, omitting the loss of the 4 carriers. But among those who knew the facts, Yamamoto, Nagumo, and their surviving officers, there was only despair. The loss of the carriers meant the loss of Japan's most skilled aviators. They could replace the ships, but not the men who had trained for years to fly from their decks. The Imperial Navy had lost not just machines, but the very heart of its striking power. For the United States, Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was psychological redemption. The fear that had haunted the American people since December 7, 1941, began to lift. Across the Pacific, from the beaches of Hawaii to the White House in Washington, there was a renewed belief that Japan could be defeated. The war was far from over, but its course had changed forever. As the sun set on June 5th, the Pacific looked deceptively calm. The waves rolled gently over the graves of men and machines that had changed history. Above that vast ocean, a new reality emerged. The United States was no longer fighting to survive, it was now fighting to win. In the weeks that followed Midway, the Pacific Ocean seemed to breathe differently. The vast blue expanse that once belonged to the Japanese Empire had shifted in spirit. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the tide of war had turned subtly but decisively. News of the victory rippled across the Allied world. Newspapers from New York to London declared it a miracle at sea, while in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the report with quiet satisfaction. "This," he told his advisers, "is our first step toward victory." But even as America celebrated, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his commanders knew the truth. The war had only just begun. Midway was not the end, but the beginning of a long and brutal campaign to push Japan back across the Pacific. The aftermath of Midway was a time of reflection, rebuilding, and relentless analysis. At Pearl Harbor, naval intelligence pored over captured documents and decoded messages, trying to understand how such a powerful enemy could have been defeated in just 5 minutes of chaos. The answer lay in a combination of precision and luck. The American pilots, many of whom had flown on fumes and instinct, had struck their targets at the exact moment when Japanese decks were most vulnerable, laden with fuel hoses, bombs, and torpedoes. It was an instant of destruction, so perfectly timed that it seemed orchestrated by fate. Yet beneath that luck was preparation, the courage of the men, the brilliance of the codebreakers and the leadership of admirals who trusted their instincts against a seemingly unstoppable enemy. In Tokyo, the mood was grim. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, sat in silence as the reports arrived. The losses were staggering: 4 fleet carriers, over 300 planes, and more than 3,000 men. It was the worst defeat in the history of the Imperial Navy. For Yamamoto, it was a personal humiliation. He had promised the Emperor 6 months of victories after Pearl Harbor. Midway came exactly at the end of that 6th month. Now Japan's aura of invincibility had shattered. The carrier fleet that had once dominated the Pacific had been reduced to wreckage scattered beneath the waves. Yamamoto reportedly muttered, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Those words now rang with haunting accuracy. Back in the United States, factories roared to life. Midway became a symbol of what American industry and ingenuity could achieve when tested. Shipyards accelerated production. New carriers like Essex and Yorktown II began construction. Aircraft manufacturers rolled out squadrons of new fighters and dive bombers, faster, stronger, and deadlier. Pilots who had survived Midway became instructors, training the next generation of naval aviators who would soon carry the war to Japan's doorstep. Across the nation, the spirit of determination hardened into something immovable. The defeat at Pearl Harbor was no longer the defining moment of the Pacific War. Midway was. On the islands of the Pacific, however, the reality of the coming conflict loomed large. American planners knew that pushing Japan back would mean island by island, reef by reef, across thousands of miles of ocean. The victory at Midway gave them confidence, but it also revealed how costly each triumph could be. The men of the U.S. Navy began preparing for new battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and eventually Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The road ahead was long, and Japan would not surrender easily. But now the initiative belonged to the Allies. For Japan's pilots and sailors, morale sank to unseen depths. The survivors of Midway returned home to a nation in denial. Propaganda tried to conceal the full scope of the disaster, but whispers spread through naval bases and barracks. Many began to realize that Japan's empire had reached its zenith, and that every battle from this point forward would be a retreat. Training schools rushed to replace lost aviators, but the new pilots lacked the experience that had once defined the Japanese carrier force. By 1943, Japan would be sending barely trained teenagers into combat against an American Air Force growing stronger by the month. As the Pacific settled into a tense lull, both sides understood what Midway truly meant. The United States had not only won a battle, it had proven that Japan could be beaten. The myth of Japanese naval supremacy was broken. From this moment on, every Japanese ship that sailed and every aircraft that took off did so under the shadow of Midway. And though many more would die before the war ended, those 5 minutes on June 4th had changed everything. The ocean that once belonged to Japan now whispered with a new voice, one that spoke of vengeance, resilience, and the unstoppable march toward victory. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, and the Japanese Empire signed its surrender aboard the USS Missouri, many of the men who had fought at Midway were scattered across the globe, some commanding fleets, others training new pilots, and many buried beneath the Pacific they once ruled. Yet in every naval briefing, every combat strategy, and every war memoir that followed, the Battle of Midway stood as the defining moment, the fulcrum upon which the entire Pacific War had turned. It was not merely a victory of ships or planes, but a triumph of intelligence, courage, and improvisation. What happened on June 4, 1942, was proof that even against impossible odds, precision and resolve could rewrite history. In the years that followed, historians would dissect the battle endlessly. They studied how U.S. codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25 and uncovered the attack on Midway before it began. They analyzed the decisions of Admirals Nimitz, Fletcher, and Spruance, how they gambled with scarce carriers and limited air power, yet struck with perfect timing. And they remembered the young men in the skies, pilots like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Dick Best, whose courage and intuition guided their dive bombers through anti-aircraft fire and clouds of smoke to deliver death from above. The story of Midway was not one of luck alone. It was the culmination of human brilliance and sacrifice under unbearable pressure. For Japan, Midway became a haunting echo, a lesson written in fire and steel. The Imperial Navy, once thought invincible, never fully recovered. The loss of 4 fleet carriers crippled Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. The nation's finest naval aviators, trained over years of rigorous discipline, were gone. In their place came hurried recruits, flying outdated planes against an enemy now armed with superior numbers and ever-improving technology. Admiral Yamamoto, who had warned his government that war with the United States would be a long and desperate struggle, watched his prophecy unfold. Within a year, Japan's offensive would grind to a halt. Within 3, its cities would burn, and within 4, its empire would collapse under the weight of total defeat. Midway, however, was more than a military victory. It was a turning point in the human spirit. For the Americans who fought there, it proved that innovation, teamwork, and trust in one another could overcome the most powerful empire on Earth. It became the moral rallying cry of the Pacific, evidence that justice could rise from disaster. The same men who had seen the flames of Pearl Harbor now saw redemption in the smoke of burning Japanese carriers. The ocean that had once been a graveyard now shimmered with promise. And in that promise lay the foundation of a new era of naval warfare. One dominated not by battleships, but by aircraft carriers, intelligence networks, and aerial supremacy. As decades passed, the veterans of Midway grew older, their numbers fading with each Memorial Day. Yet the memory of what they accomplished remained undiminished. The coral atoll itself, small, windswept, and lonely, became sacred ground, preserved as a symbol of what ordinary men can achieve when faced with annihilation. The rusted wrecks that still lie beneath its waters serve as silent witnesses to their bravery, and the seabirds that circle above are the living echoes of the planes that once roared through those same skies. The legacy of Midway continues to shape military thinking even today. Its lessons about intelligence, timing, leadership, and resolve are taught in war colleges around the world. Every generation of pilots and sailors studies that single day in June, learning how a handful of carriers and courage changed the direction of a world war. For the United States, Midway marked the moment when fear turned to faith and retreat gave way to advance. For Japan, it was the moment when empire began to crumble. In the end, the Battle of Midway was more than history. It was destiny. 5 minutes of fire had redrawn the map of the Pacific, and in doing so, secured the path to Allied victory. As the sun set over the ocean that had seen so much blood, it glinted off the waves as if reflecting the spirits of those who fought there. Midway had proven that wars are not won by might alone, but by the courage to seize a fleeting moment and turn it into forever.